mentioned, I'm also the co-focal point for sustainable land management and restoration and coordinator of the Coalition of Action for Soil Health. Happy to be here today. Over back to you, Audrey.
Lovely, guys. Thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to the session two. This is the series two of our webinar, Road to COP17. This is a virtual global youth engagement series. So we welcome you here. And today's session is really focusing on Riyadh to Ulaanbaatar. I'm sure many of us know or might not know that COP16 happened in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh. It was amazing, phenomenal. And this year, COP17 will be happening in Mongolia, specifically Ulaanbaatar. And today we're looking at taking advantage of the opportunity to reflect on what has already been agreed on in Riyadh, what were the commitments, what have been the commitments, and what does it mean for young people like ourselves to prepare for COP17 in the coming weeks. And so if you're here for the first time, if you've already been engaged with the UNCCD Youth Caucus, we're excited to have you here. And we'll like to quickly begin by having us introduce ourselves. And I can see that that's already been done. We are calling from India, the Emirates, Nigeria, Indonesia, Uganda. This is beautiful representation of youth everywhere. And we really appreciate that. I would also like us to have or share our comments, which I already highlighted in the chat, of what we hope to see or hear at COP. And some of us wanted to learn. Some of us mentioned that we're looking to understand more on the processes. Some are looking at understanding what sustainable land management entails, how to protect biodiversity, restore ecosystems. How could there be real action? So I think you're in the right place. In today's session, I would like to, first of all, use this opportunity to incredibly introduce our amazing speaker, Wangui Mwangi. And Wangui Mwangi has joined us today, and she is calling us from, or she's calling in from Kenya. And I would like to read a brief introduction from her for her. But before I do, I think Daniela would be able to kickstart us and give us a brief preparation and share a bit of what happened at COP16. So, Francis, if you can share our slides, that would also be awesome. But in the meantime, I'll give it to Daniela to kickstart this for us.
Thanks so much, everyone. And I think we have a few slides to share. So I don't know if Francis, you're able to. Otherwise, I could share my screen too. But as Audrey mentioned, we're building from COP16, which happened in 2024 in Riyadh. We wanted to share what happened there. So let me just go over to, if you go a bit further down to the slides on the updates from COP16, we have a report from what happened. So maybe Audrey, while I present, if you want to share the link on the chat, you can also just scan the QR code that you see on the page. And then, just some insights. I won't deep dive into it, as you can then, after the session, I invite you to explore the report, but it shares around, what happened, what did youth engagement look like. So we held the fourth edition of the Youth Forum under the theme Youth Action for Land, Restoring Resilient and Sustainable Futures, really bringing together diverse stakeholders to address and discuss critical issues related to DLDD. So that stands for drought, land degradation, and land degradation, addressing that. So, and really, the forum serve as a platform for youth to exchange ideas, build skills, mobilize action. In the report, you see how we're driving the implementation of the youth engagement strategy. Also, a high-level event that took place on People's Day. We developed a youth declaration ahead of COP16. There was also a decision on the youth engagement strategy, which was developed and launched by the Secretariat in 2024. Uh, Francis, if you could go just back before. And then there was also the Land Youth Negotiators Program, where over 100 young people were trained ahead of COP16. So that really shows the breadth of what took place. But just some insights to, what was COP16. So it was actually the largest UNCCD COP in history, and really shifting the mindset in how youth are recognized as essential partners and not just observers. It was also one of the largest youth delegations ever, really comprising negotiators, like I mentioned, through the Youth Negotiation Academy, researchers, entrepreneurs, farmers, community leaders. So there was a huge delegation that took place. The presidency actually funded 70 youth delegates to attend, and really that showed that meaningful participation from youth requires financial commitments to break down these barriers. So that's one of the key gaps we aim to address, the financial barriers that youth face in accessing these spaces. We also moved from really on the sidelines to the center of action. As I mentioned, we had the youth forum, we had bilateral meetings, we had direct policy negotiations. We were in the room. And as I mentioned, there was also the landmark adoption of the youth engagement strategy, really formalizing how young people are recognized as leaders, really leading restoration and all action on the ground. We also understood that there's some gaps that still remain in how young people can engage, because participation is not enough, right? It's not just about being in the room, but it's also there was a strong call for direct access to finance, really targeted capacity building and accountability to turn COP promises into action on the ground. So, looking ahead, what does that look like? It's not really about if we're at the table anymore, it's how we can turn that participation into active implementation. So, really moving from commitments to measurable impact. The questions we're asking ourselves as we head to COP17 is how do we operationalize the yes strategy, so the youth engagement strategy, and how do we scale youth-led entrepreneurship, innovation, action by addressing the barriers that I've just mentioned. And I guess now, we're preparing for COP17, so we're preparing to shape the outcomes. Wango here will present a bit more about the Riyadh Action Agenda, opportunities of how young people can engage in this process. But maybe I'll hand it back over to Audrey so she can walk us through the conversation with the amazing and wonderful Wangu. Over back to you, Audrey, and thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Daniela, for helping us reflect on what happened in COP16 Riyadh. And I like that we have a lot of youth from all over the world listening in. Today we have, I'm incredibly pleased to have us join us, Wangui Mwangi, and to help us unpack all of this, we have Wangui Mwangi, who's a senior advisor and programs lead of the Land and Soil Loop at Ambition Loop. As well, she brings her expertise in linking international sustainability into initiatives with community-based development actions. Her work is exploring how to better link scientific data and global policy commitments on land restoration with realities on the ground. Wangu has held various strategic communications roles, including with TMG Think Tank for Sustainability, the United Nations University, you name it. And in between, she also serves as a consultant with diverse international research and development organizations. So for the past 5 years, Wangu has been based as well at her organic farm in central Kenya, which she aspires to grow into a farm-based ecotourism venture. Wangu has also been closely involved in the Riyadh Action Agenda processes, and today she brings valuable insights into how, the commitments, the partnerships, and implementation efforts are also helping to shape the road that we are on to COP17. So everyone, help me, and thank you so much, Wangu, for joining us today. Help me welcome Wangu, and maybe a virtual round of applause, and the floor is yours. I would also probably our first question to Wang as she presents is helping us enlightening our understanding around what is the Riyadh Action Agenda, how does it differ from what is negotiated inside the rooms, and what has happened since COP16. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much, Wangu, for being here with us.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, and apologies. It's I'm based, as you said, I'm based at my farm, and apologies for the couch behind me because I'm literally sitting on the floor trying to get a connection. So I won't try to jinx it, but just in case, please continue discussing if I have to reconnect on my phone, but I'll try to stay online. So thank you so much. And I think the first reflection I have, even before I start with the slides, is that this is a truly intergenerational dialogue, because I think if you would look at my hairs, there's more gray than black. And I think I started as a very young person following this UNCCD process right from the beginning, like right from the negotiation process, and I followed it right through. So I really value always these conversations of just saying what I think, because I call myself also a UNCCD champion, although I'm not recognized by the UNCCD, but I really believe in this convention and believe it's just one of the three Rio conventions. It's the one that really connects with what's happening on the ground, like what people's livelihoods and what matters. So I'm really very passionate about it. And so it's, in a sense, it's really lucky for me that I'm now working with Ambition Loop and looking at this Riyadh Action Agenda. So maybe if you could just start to share the slides, because unfortunately I'm not in a position to do that with my choppy network. Yeah. Thank you so much. So I'll try and introduce this. So as you can see there, this is just a headline slide, but we already think of what we are doing as scaling ambition across the Rio Convention. So Ambition Loop, maybe just stay there a little bit. Ambition Loops connects actions across climate, biodiversity, but also many other global challenges. So from, name it, from mangrove conservation to agriculture and food systems to industrial decarbonization. And the overarching idea of Ambition Loop is really to try and go beyond what we call the loop of fear, the fear loop, to, like feeling that challenges are so big we cannot do anything about them, to the ambition loop, which is really how do you bring people to really start to build momentum and say that we can do this and we can make it happen. So what happened, Ambition Loop is really started by champions, climate champions, high-level climate champions. So it came very much from the climate space. But at COP16, the presidency, the Saudi presidency wanted to sort of bring this same idea into the UNCCD. And so that's why we had the Riyadh Action Agenda being launched. If you could go to the next slide, please. The idea really was to see how beyond the state commitments, you could bring a much more broader coalition of partners to also boost momentum. So if you look at those numbers that we're talking about, there are 1.5 billion hectares of degraded land under restoration. This is not an ambition loop target or goal. This is the UNCCD goal under the land degradation neutrality sort of objective, which is also then aligned to this to the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's very much an existing ambition globally, but as we all know, I mean, 2030 is just around the corner, and there is no way we are going to achieve this. So really the idea is how can we mobilize even more momentum, even more ambition from people that may not necessarily be in the room to really work together. So these are just some of the headline targets that we're working towards. If you can go just to the next slide. I'm just going to run pretty quickly through them because we can always share these afterwards. As I mentioned, this idea is coming from the UNC, from the climate space. And there you had 2030 breakthroughs, and you had the race to resilience, the race to zero. These are some of the ideas around really convening broad partnerships from across private sector, civil society, and so on to contribute towards a shared global goal. So how we bring this into the UNCCD process and space is what we call the land and soil breakthroughs. And these are like a set of targets. If you look at that wheel on the right, we have in the center, obviously people being the most important, but around that, we have three thematic areas, which were broadly linked to also the thematic priorities at COP16. So land conservation and restoration, agriculture and food systems, and then drought and water resilience. As you may recall, if you were at COP16, drought was a really big issue, and it remains a very big issue at the UNCCD. But surrounding that, we also have what we call enablers, because you cannot achieve any of these targets without really looking at inclusive science, technology, looking at finance, clearly really important, and governance. And when you talk about governance, it's also about those people that are going to do the actual actions. Do they have secure access to tenure? Do they have the confidence to invest in the land or in sort of the resources that they are working? So that's really critical. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So what we have done is, around those thematic areas, we have tried to convene coalitions of partners. So for instance, partners working on grasslands, rangelands, and savannas, or on agriculture and food systems. If you see at the bottom there, we have 4 what we call breakthrough coalitions, bringing together about 70 partners, and that's actually growing even as we go towards COP. And so what they do is they look at those overarching goals I showed at the beginning, and then see what's realistic for us as a coalition. What could we actually bring to the table? So it's not looking at the big 1.5 billion, but it's like, what can we achieve realistically, but still in an ambitious way? And then what we need to then move forward. So they develop these targets, and then they develop a roadmap for achieving that. And then building on that, hopefully then a business case, some kind of plan to get investments so that we can actually execute that plan. So if you go to the next slide, please. So just to give you an example of some of these targets that are being set now within the coalitions, still remembering that we are looking at those overarching targets. Actually, we used to call these the land breakthrough targets. But then we were also reminded very gently by the Secretariat and other parties that there's already existing targets. You have the LDN target, you have the SDGs. So just to avoid confusion and to show that this is really coming from the non-state actor space, that's why we're calling them breakthroughs rather than breakthrough targets, because they're very much aligned to the existing targets. So these are just some of the numbers. And I think why these are important, like for instance, if you look at the first one, 400 to 600 million hectares of degraded rangelands restored or under restoration. This is not just a figure out of the top of our head. This has been negotiated, reviewed, assessed by the members of that coalition, who include big players like WWF, IUCN, International Land Coalition, to small organizations really working on the ground. And again, verified, checked by the UNCCD scientific, some of the members of the scientific science policy interface of the UNCCD, who also say that, yes, this is actually achievable. So these are not just a dream, but it's actually something that partners together think, if we really work together, we could achieve this and contribute to the overarching goals. And not to forget, we now have within the UNCCD a review process. Some of you might have gone to the CRIC or to some of the CST meetings. There's already a process underway where countries report on how far they're going. But in many countries, non-state actors are not necessarily part of that process. So what some of these networks working to plant trees or rehabilitate dry lands, maybe what they're doing is not even being reflected in what parties are reporting. So this is also why this breakthrough approach is so important, because we are saying, let's bring everybody else outside the table and show, aggregate what they're doing, and then maybe we can actually realize that we are getting closer to these goals, much closer than we thought. So I'll just skip the next slide. So we have something similar for food systems and also for drought. So we can look at that later, just so I can rush a bit. But sticking here a little bit, how then I said before that sometimes some of these efforts are not being reflected in what countries are reporting. So what we're trying to do is having this community platform. It's an online dashboard where everybody self-reports. We're not dictating to anybody obviously there's some scientific issues there, but basically we're just saying to encourage engagement. Tell us what you're doing, wherever you are, even if it's just restoring 2 hectares, or restoring 500. So we have big organizations like Just Dig It, which is a really big global initiative. They are also part of this. And they have restored 500 million hectares, so there's big numbers, but also small numbers. And the idea really is there's no threshold. Anybody can report what they're restoring, but then we aggregate those numbers. And so that's why you can see this is just sort of a composite. It's not, we're still working on the back end, but then you can now come up with a very impressive overall, impression of what people are doing. And what we then would do next is, hopefully, if you go to the next slide, we would then try and bring this back to the UNCCD and say, hey, we will be launching this platform. We will be saying to parties, this is actually what non-state actors are doing, but maybe you are not even reflecting. And so how could we bring this back into the formal process so that we can inject a bit more momentum? So this is just some of the things we're going to be doing at COP17 together with partners like Cash, that Daniela is amazingly leading, and others. We're going to really be bringing some of the ideas to COP. But I just wanted to talk a little bit more about this action agenda idea. And I know we're going to have a question and answer session, so I'm rushing a little bit through this, but please bear with me for that. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. But I think what is super exciting for us, really, at this moment, is that this has been recognized now. So we have now 3 paragraphs within the decision text that are going to be negotiated at COP17, where the action agenda is referenced. And so one of those is the decision text on engagement with civil society organizations and other non-state actors. We have now a recognition of the Riyadh Action Agenda as an innovation and legacy to the UNCCD process. And this is super important because what we're trying to say is that this is additional to, because you can already imagine this might look like we're trying to come in and replace everything else that's going on. So we're saying this is additional to the UNCCD Youth Caucus, like what you're doing, what the Gender Caucus is doing, what the UNCCD Civil Society panel is doing. We're saying this is additional to and supportive of. So it's not replacing any of those established and existing mechanisms. And I think very closely linked to that, as you saw from the beginning, we're talking about Rio synergies. We really want to anchor this within the UNCCD process itself and not just as a succession of presidential initiatives. So it was called the Riyadh Action Agenda. The Mongolians are going to launch their STEP Action Agenda. And obviously, if this would just continue, you would just have a succession of every host having their own initiative. So what we're really trying to do is to say, how can you institutionalize the action agenda as it has been done in the climate space? So that way you have the Global Climate Action Agenda, do something similar for UNCCD, so that then you start to really have longer term planning, sort of objectives, targets, goals, and then eventually bring that back into the reporting process. So let's say, right now we know that the UNCCD reporting cycle is 4 years. So imagine if every 4 years you could report under the action agenda what you are doing as coalitions. That would really inject a lot of energy into the process. And I'm almost done. So the next one I just wanted to also highlight is, I mentioned before about Rio synergies. There's actually, again, explicit text proposed in the synergies decision, where also encouraging the different presidencies to work together. So like what I was saying, avoid this, every presidency have their own initiative. But also now, I mentioned our organization is led by former high-level climate champions. So they are part of this group of UN high-level climate champions, and they are really talking, like, for instance, to the COP31 presidency, but also to the presidency of Armenia for biodiversity, to see how they could start to look at these action agendas sort of as a synergistic, complete, whole, and not as individual sort of fragmented initiatives. So we are really, really happy to see this proposed text, in which we did not even bring ourselves, but I mean, obviously we have been pushing, but really happy to see that it has been taken up. We don't know whether this will survive the negotiation process, but it's a great start, and we really hope that this will inject momentum. And I think on the last slide that I will show next, is this just an example of how these synergies would start to work. So for those of you who have followed the climate process, you know that there's this very complicated action agenda with axes, thematic axes, and activation groups, and so forth and so forth, and plans to accelerate. But what happened in Berlin is that there was also an incorporation of actors also from the UNCCD space into some of those coalitions. And so that's why you see, for instance, we are actively involved in the resilient agriculture investment for net zero with RAIZ, which is a Brazilian initiative. So, and RAIZ is also very much involved in the UNCCD. So eventually what we hope to start to see is this sort of cross-fertilization. So you're not just talking about a climate agenda, a land agenda, a biodiversity agenda, but there's also that sort of horizontal synergy and logic. So we're really, really happy about this as a development. And I think I just want to leave you with an encouraging quote on the next final slide, that this is all about systems. Change happens in a systemic way. It doesn't happen just in, of course, little change matters, but ultimately you have to change the entire system. But we really believe if we all come together that we can achieve this change that we aspire to and desire. So thank you so much. I know it's a little bit rushed, but I'm really happy to have a discussion with you.
Phenomenal presentation. Thank you so much, Wangu. This is very enlightening. Thank you for this overview and helping us better understand the Riyadh Action Agenda. I think you've already touched on some really important things around how commitment just doesn't exist on paper. It requires collaboration, accountability, implementation. And just building on your presentation here, we have a few questions. And as you've walked us through the action agenda and how it works, could you just help share more on how you engage and navigate collaboration between the different stakeholders in this process? So whether it be secretariat, presidency, members of the civil society, panel, youth, can you help us understand or share more on the engagement and navigation and making sure they collaborate? Yeah.
Okay, no, thank you. Maybe before I jump into that, I don't know whether there was any general question about the presentation, maybe whether there's anything I need to clarify first. If not, I'll be happy to jump into that as well.
I think not yet, but maybe just
okay, perfect.
yes,
yeah.
yes.
So you just don't want to lose that. All right. Yeah. So as I mentioned, and here I'm going to be a little bit politically incorrect. I like being that once in a while. Obviously, the Riyadh Action Agenda is a new kid on the block. We already we have existing mechanisms, civil society mechanisms within the UNCCD. So to be very honest, there has been, even in Riyadh, a lot of questions about, so what is this? Why the Riyadh Action Agenda? And for those of you who follow the climate process, we also know that our dear Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is not always necessarily a party that is always on the side of progress on some of these issues. So, I mean, I'm being very honest here. So I think we've had to really get out of that connection with a presidency, a country, and maybe their agenda to how is this something bigger? And honestly, to their credit, Dr. Osama, who is the one in charge of the Riyadh Action Agenda on the Saudi side, the presidency side, is a really committed and passionate, sort of advocate for injecting momentum, for really bringing everybody around the table. And that is what has set the tone. So I think in terms of how we connect with the presidency, they see us as Ambition Loop, in a sense, as an NGO, but sort of working at the global space as a way to bring even more actors that may not necessarily be part of this. So to sort of broaden the tent and increase the ambition, increase the momentum. So in that sense, that's how we work with the presidency. And we are now moving in the same way to work with the Mongolian COP17 presidency. Again, how we do it is more like showing them what could happen, what could be. So because presidencies tend to be very stuck on the political agenda, and getting those negotiations adopted and so on. So what we try and say is, look, if you open it up, you will get even more energy, even more momentum. So that's really a role we play with the presidencies, and we are starting to see again a similar sort of trajectory with the COP17 presidency. Also very interested to see how they can build on this legacy and sort of bring it even more into the other conventions. In terms of the Secretariat, again, at the beginning, also there was a bit of confusion, but increasingly we see really they are enthusiastically embracing this idea of a bigger agenda. So not just presidency driven, but really housed within the Secretariat and really echoing what the climate space is doing. So a land action agenda. So again, we're more like resource persons, really showing them this is what's possible. So like with some of these coalitions, they're very interested, for instance, in this dashboard that we're developing, because they see that as a real value add to the praise reporting platform for the UNCCD. It can really, again, inject momentum. In terms of other civil society actors, yeah, we had some interesting discussions. Like, I don't know if any of you went to Desertifactions, which was this meeting, civil society meeting in Tunisia a couple of months ago, where we were being asked the same question, like, are we not replicating, reinventing the wheel? But again, we really tried to explain that we are broadening the discussion. We are opening it up to even more people. So it's everything builds on what's existing. It's not in competition. So by saying we here, I guess I'm talking more from Ambition Loop, but Ambition Loop as the organization that has been tasked with supporting the delivery of this Riyadh Action Agenda. But eventually, I mean, this is a shared process. So it's not just about one organization. It's very much a shared process. I don't know if I answered the question, but yeah, let me leave it at that to just allow more inputs.
You certainly did, Wangu. This is enriching. Thank you so much. I think now I'd like to look at youth contribution and how many of the youth, including myself, are joining us today. And we're wondering, where do we fit into this journey, right? How can young people meaningfully contribute to this action agenda and maybe broader to the road to COP17?
No, important question. I think I'm a strong believer in you just push that. You have to push the door. You have to just go in there and say, I'm here, like, don't wait for permission. Don't wait to be invited. And I think that is what, with the youth engagement strategy and the work you're doing, the UNCCD Youth Caucus, but also other initiatives like the youth negotiators, I really see a lot of ambition, not only ambition, but very coordinated, very structured, very strategic engagement coming from young people. And I think that's a way to do it. I think you just have to keep banging on the door and saying, hey, we are here, and don't tell us we're the leaders of tomorrow. We're already leading now. We're, that's cliche, like we are. So I think really it's about showcasing what is happening. And that's what we're trying to do with the Riyadh Action Agenda, saying, hey, here's a dashboard, show what a youth group in Benin has, how many hectares of land they have conserved. We actually give this platform so you can actually, as an initiative, showcase what you're doing, and but then collectively, then, because the collection, the aggregation is also important. So it's not just about lobbying as youth, but actually showing collective progress. I think the more you can aggregate these things, and that's why you have the caucus and other structured mechanisms. I think if you come as a group, as an organized sort of mechanism body, then it's also easier to achieve more. So I think being united as you are, and really working strategically, looking at the decisions that are coming up, seeing where there's a gap, where you could strengthen the language. Basically, all the homework that every specific stakeholder group has to do, I would say, yeah, you would have to do the same. But I honestly believe that the UNCCD, even compared to the other conventions, is pretty open. And I think part of the advantage that we have with the UNCCD is that it's small. Look at the chaos of climate. It's so huge. It's smaller, and maybe the issues are not as divisive as they are under climate. So again, another really important opportunity. And why we believe in this action agenda approach is that you could actually start in the UNCCD and start to impact other multilateral processes. So see it that way. See this as sort of an entry point to then maybe having a bigger voice also in some of the other places where maybe the youth voice is not as recognized or as welcome. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think as youth, we need to say we are here and knock on the door. I like that. I like that. And I think many of us here have that spirit and really eager to create that impact. So looking ahead, you shared what's coming next for the action agenda. When you do think about the legacy, you hope for this agenda and what it will leave. Can you share what success may look like for you? Not just in the negotiating rooms, but on the ground, in communities, landscapes around the world. We'll be happy to just pick your brain and really see how you see things.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, actually, it's a really good question, and something I'm very much involved right now in, because as I mentioned before, we have convened these global partnerships, what we call breakthrough coalitions. We've come up with these huge numbers, but ultimately, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of the life of a pastoralist, in a savannah somewhere, or somebody in an informal settlement, so ultimately you have to think of change in terms of what it contributes to the lives of people, especially those who are at the moment kind of locked out of the system. So what we're trying to do now is going to the next phase. So having come up with these big numbers, having agreed that it's really important to work together, we want to start to test this out. And where we believe, you mentioned the word landscape, we believe that really the unit, this place where you can really show change is at that ecosystem landscape level. So what we're trying to see is now beyond these thematic coalitions, could we bring across those coalitions, so across drought, for somebody who's facing water scarcity, who's facing prolonged drought, honestly, they don't care, where the help is coming from. So it's all connected. And we also know climate change impacts on everything. So what we're trying to do is see how we can bring these coalitions now together at a landscape, or let's say hotspot level, to see, like, for instance, if there's a particular area of Eastern Africa, which is really ravaged by drought, could you bring the organizations that are working there, whether they're coming from food or from climate or biodiversity, but bring them together to look at the challenge in a sort of systemic, coordinated way, and then agree on what everybody is going to do. So what we don't want to do is to start new projects yet again and start redefining the challenge again. We want to start from the place where we recognize there's a real need to scale up action, move fast, and really bring coalitions of the willing, in a sense. Say, okay, now we are rolling up our sleeves. This is what we're going to do for the Horn of Africa for the next 5 years. And, but really bring it down to that level. And obviously that also implies that you have to connect with the networks, the actors that are working on the ground. So that's really, really important. So some of these coalitions that we're convening a meeting in Nairobi next week, for instance, and we are trying not just the members working on rangelands or food systems, but also those working on markets, access to markets, working on training on sustainable agriculture, but bringing everybody together, because only then can you ensure that any action you do doesn't have an unexpected sort of effect, consequence. So for instance, you could focus so much on planting trees, that you forget about livelihoods, or you could focus so much on sustainable agriculture that you forget about markets, or you forget about where is the water going to come from. So that's why we need to connect all of this. But we believe in doing that and listening to those that are actually experiencing these challenges, that then you can connect those dots. Because in the end, it's about connecting from local to global. Of course, it's not as easy. It's not as easy said as done, but there's no other way. That's the only way we have to do this. We have to connect. Yeah.
I'm getting excited. I wish we could make this probably a 2-day session. Thanks, Wangu. I think those are the questions we have for now. But the audience will love to have you also ask your questions. We're opening the floor. Please feel free to use the Q&A box, the chat. Raise your hands if you like to come off mute. Just keep your questions crisp and short and sweet. I think there were a few that were also asked already, and I would like to pull the first one that I think I saw. And from Imbuza Sezi, he said, "What is the best first action we as youth can begin to overcome the challenge of degraded land by agriculture?" Yeah.
Wow, that's a tough one, because I don't know whether there's one action. I think maybe what I was trying to allude to before is context matters. I think you have to start where you are, and I think we have to go beyond. I'm really strongly convinced. I come from the NGO world, and every NGO has their agenda. This is, we plant trees, or we support women, or I think we have to take a step back and really look at what is a challenge that needs to be solved, and that may not necessarily be what you're doing yourself. So I think it takes that humility of accepting that you have to connect, let's say, with other NGOs. So even as a youth group, of course, it's really a youth organization. It's very important that you bring a lot of energy, but you have to start by saying what is needed, what's the need, and then build from that. So implicit in that is connecting with others, working in that space, so not coming in with just your ideas, but really seeing what's needed in that community or in that ecosystem, and then trying to join forces. So I really think young people bring a lot of energy, but it's also really important. Also, sometimes I'm old, also listen to the older people who've seen it all, who've been, so I think it's really about connections. Yeah.
Beautifully said. Connection, and that whole intergenerational dialogue, and also just being able to move from local to global. I think the second question is kind of tied to the first one in a way, and simply how you think youth inclusion and conservation help restore pastoral lands. Yeah, you can briefly touch on that if you're able to.
Oh gosh, yeah. You're really putting me on the spot here. But I think we all know that this is the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists as well. And I think what's super encouraging about that is that for the first time, this very excluded, neglected, part of the world is coming under the radar once again. And I think that's also a lot of thanks to the presidency of Mongolia, Botswana, and other countries who have really advocated and pushed for that. And as you know, I think one of the big initiatives that's going to be there during the Rangelands high level at COP is that they're going to launch what they're calling the Rangeland of Coalition States. This sounds like I'm starting very high up, but the reason I'm saying this is because there is already a global momentum. So for the first time, there's a real opportunity to sort of, dock into what's going on and really start to see how do you build that agenda from the ground up. So again, I know it's very simplistic, but I would say it's about also the pastoralist organizations coming together, having a bigger voice, and then using this space that's now opening up to really also get onto the political agenda and to push. Because we know in our countries, I come from Kenya, I know many other countries, pastoralism, sort of mobile livelihoods are often ignored or seen as backward or seen as not really contributing when they contribute a huge amount. So I think you need the researchers there, to really show, like what pastoralism actually contributes. Maybe you need more young people from pastoralist backgrounds really doing PhDs in these issues, so that you can really start to speak at a very sort of scientific, building on real evidence, what the challenge is. Because often you also lose, you don't have a voice because you're also not part of the narrative. Like you're not really you're not really having the research, you're not having sort of the very strong advocacy. So I think I would really encourage also young people coming from pastoralist backgrounds. We start to see a lot of very active youth networks, youth pastoralist networks in Kenya, for instance, and they're changing the narrative. So I would say, like, really also engage in research, but also in building sort of those movements, but really building on actual evidence and research, because I think that is part of the problem sometimes. It's important, we know it's important, but you also need to have a very compelling case, of why this matters and why more action should be taken, especially to influence policy at the national level.
That's phenomenal. The questions are coming in, really, Wangu. The last one I think I could ask, is how can efforts of communities working on landscape and land restoration be recognized when they are not represented in decision-making processes? So this participation may be limited by financial constraints, etc. So how can efforts of communities working on landscape and restoration be recognized when they're not represented in decision-making processes?
No, absolutely, very important question. And like I said at the beginning, I like to be politically incorrect. What I also believe is we will never get every single community of every country in the world represented. It will never happen. There's no way everybody will go to COP. And I don't even know that that's necessary. I don't know whether that's the most important and useful way to influence. So I really believe is people need to do what they're best at. So I think at the community level, you need the kind of support systems that empower communities to really do their best. So the right kind of training, on right kind of exposure to fair markets. So I really believe where change really happens is in those intermediary organizations. I really believe, because if they have integrity, so those NGOs that say they work with, communities, or say they represent, or those membership organizations like cooperatives who work with farmers, it's at that level really that you need to have sort of a lot of integrity, a lot of transparency, but also a lot of coordination. Because if you start to do that, then you will genuinely be representing the interests of communities. So of course, it's important to have community representatives come to these international meetings, but I always don't believe that they're necessarily the most. If you bring, imagine if I'd never been to out of Kenya, and then you bring me from my farm, bring me to COP, will I be the most, So I really believe we need to work at that intermediary level, make sure that we're picking up on the experience on the ground, on the challenges, and then bringing those up. So really, again, that idea of connections, so that we're really bringing everything to the right sort of space in terms of decision making. But how then communities influence that obviously is also an issue of governance. And also that's why I think it's so important that you have the networks that are working around governance, around land tenure, around women's land rights. These kinds of initiatives are super important, because ultimately it's about ensuring that the person on the ground has a voice as well. So I would encourage you, from wherever angle you work, to really connect to those advocacy networks, bring those insights so that there's a bigger voice, because then ultimately that will benefit the person that is voiceless at the moment. And yeah, I know yeah, maybe I'm being a bit harsh, but I think we're not going to bring everybody, to the table, because it's just not realistic. But we need the people that represent those people on the ground need to be honest and have integrity and also and be transparent and work together. Sorry, I'm talking too much. I'll
No,
shut up.
this is a treasure trove of knowledge. So keep going, Wangu. We've got two main questions for
Almost out
you.
of time.
Yes, don't worry, it's good. So we've got a question. This is a student, right, that just quickly wants some advice in what major to choose and how that would, and if she wanted to contribute to global sustainability and the work with UNCCD. She just wants some rich advice from you on what to do and how that would help her contribute to our issues around. Yeah.
No, interesting. I think um, I don't know, Daniela, others, who are working in this space. I honestly don't think it matters what major you do, because land is at the core of everything. So you could come at it like from the legal side, you could come at it from the technical scientific side in terms of, like soil organic carbon or just thing around, from the climate side, but you could come at it from anything, any direction. And I think that this is where we're going with this synergies agenda, because ultimately it's all connected. But I really believe any major, so I don't know whether you would be more from the arts side or from the science side, but I think for land, if you're coming more from the arts or maybe social science side, I would say really getting into those issues of land governance, really analyzing, why things don't work, why change is not happening fast enough, how to really build capacity on the ground. I think some of those areas are really important, because I think sometimes there's such a huge gap in the research between the technical sort of conceptual knowledge and the actual real economy, as we call it, the real economy issues. What makes things work? What makes things shift? So I think if you would come at it, for instance, from trade, from fair markets, I think some of those areas are not as covered, but they're so important in the UNCCD as well, because yes, you may build the capacity of farmers to grow crops even in an organic, sustainable way, but then if you don't have a market and those crops are just rotting and it doesn't impact on their livelihood, so what does it matter? So I would say go at it from wherever angle feels comfortable, where's your safe space. But I think, like I showed in that wheel at the beginning, keeping people at the heart, keeping people at the center of whatever you're doing, I think it will ultimately connect to this land and UNCCD agenda. Because again, like I said at the beginning, I'm an advocate for the UNCCD. I think climate can be sometimes too technical. CBD can be a bit too focused on nature, which is important. Of course, we all know nature is important, but I think land and the UNCCD is really the people convention, in my view. It really puts people at the center. So anything that helps advance, like where the gaps are, why things are not happening, why people remain locked out, those kinds of studies, I think they're super interesting and super needed. Yeah.
Phenomenal. Probably a quick follow-up to that, to
Mhm.
wrap up the question and answer here is so then they're looking at how policymakers can help measure and reward community-led efforts when designing such global environmental strategies. So maybe a line or two on that. And Zishan, I can see your question, but I think just lack of time, it's been answered in the previous time. So when we get on the YouTube channel, you could find the answer there. But Wangu, it's on how we can measure and reward these community-led efforts when designing such strategies.
Oh my goodness. That's a tough one. I think here we have to go back to the national level, because ultimately that's where the reporting is done. And that's where also governments can be held accountable. So I think in as much as we know that the UNCCD's strategic priorities, for instance, one of the strategic priorities is about having actual impact in the livelihoods of people living in drylands. That's one of the UNCCD strategic objectives. So if we would hold then governments accountable for that, like how are you doing that? So as you're reporting, not just reporting that, oh, we planted 300,000 hectares of forest or we restored, but asking the question, how many people benefited? So constantly, bringing that back, then I think you start to have an impact on the people living in drylands, and also ensuring that those processes of setting the targets at the national level, monitoring those targets, implementing that, those also include representation of communities. So it cannot just be done at the ministerial level, but then that really has to be also taken to the community level, so that the communities are setting the targets themselves, are saying this is what we want to see, this is where we want to restore. So it's also about their rights. So like not deciding from the national level, this is where we're going to plant a forest, but like the community deciding this is where we want, to restore. So those kinds of interactions, but holding governments accountable. So, and this is where again the youth come in, the non-state actors come in, because when you come to the COPs, then you can ask those questions of government as they're reporting on their progress. But I know this is a pretty generic, broad answer, unfortunately, but I hope it's helpful.
A round of applause for Wangui Mwangi. Virtually, guys. Thank you so much, Wangu.
Thank you.
Thank you for your phenomenal answers. I'll take it over and give the mic to Daniela to wrap us up. Thanks so much. Grateful.
Thank you so much, Wango. I think your experience from, working at the global stage, global level in these negotiation processes, but also as a farmer yourself, it's such a interesting, yeah, your experience is so interesting, and I'm always fascinated when you speak. So thank you again for joining, Wangu. And we do have, yeah, continuing the process, because honestly, this has been amazing. I mean, I work on this every day, and I've learned so many new things. So I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. Let me just share my screen so we can then present some of the closing. I know we're running a bit over time, but I hope people can still stay as I'll be presenting. Sorry, let me just bring that down. Perfect. So as we mentioned, we've already had two, this is a webinar series. So we've already had two webinars, one from today and then from last week, around how we're advancing youth engagement in these processes. On the 25, we will have one, which is actually the monthly constituency goal of the UNCCD Youth Caucus, and we'll be co-developing the youth engagement, youth statement consultation. So as Wangu mentioned, we might not be able to be there in person, but if you want your voice to be included in all the messages that will be coming out of our engagement at the COP, please do join that so you can contribute with your voices and perspectives. And I think that's one of the entry points of how we can engage, even though we're not attending in person. There's also on the 1st of August, a logistics and safety brief. So if you are going to be attending in person, do join that session so you understand a bit more. We can help you guide through this process, because it is smaller than the COPs, but it's still 2 weeks of a lot happening. What I would suggest is that if you scan the QR code, and then Audrey, if you can share the link on the chat to the page on our website, we have built this dedicated page for COP17 where you can see all the information on these webinars, but also on other opportunities. So for example, we're going to be opening up a call for for events at a youth pavilion, which is exciting. The second time we're going to have a youth pavilion. So if you want to hold sessions, please do keep an eye out. We'll be opening up applications very soon. And there's also going to be engagements such as the Youth Forum on the 18th and 19th of August. There will be the pavilion for the 2 weeks. There will be a lot of side events. There will be the negotiations. We're exploring how to connect with parties and send them the youth statement. So a lot is happening. Do join as well. Let me just share here. You can join the WhatsApp group where we share all these opportunities as well on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. So everything is being shared online. So keep up to date with those updates. That's the thing I would share. And then you can actually, if you're not part of the UNCC Youth Caucus, you can scan this QR code so you can join. We're structured in a way where we have working groups, so regional working groups, thematic working groups, really to address desertification, land degradation, and drought issues. So if you want to engage on that too more actively, please do join. I know there was a lot of questions regarding participation at COP17. Unfortunately, we did close the call for funding and interest of the youth delegation. We will not be opening that up again. But again, if you want your voice to be heard, join join these meetings, join these consultations, make sure that your voice is in the youth statement. And then I think I'm forgetting something, but um, we have those meetings and the youth delegations who have funding and as well a confirmed registration. Please do reach out to us since we're building a youth delegation directory and making sure that young people who are participating in person and have that confirmed can have access to speaking opportunities and events and engagements. But that's only for those who have funding confirmed. So please do continue looking out for other opportunities in case those who like myself might not be able to attend. But yeah, I hope that was useful. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Francis, for coordinating as well. Wangu, thank you so much. This has been super insightful. I'm super inspired, and I hope everyone else is too. So thanks again. I don't know if any last thoughts from the team, and then we can close out the session. And thank you for joining.
Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you guys. Please feel free to connect and have a very blessed weekend.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you.
everybody. And
Bye-bye.
just as an addition, you can have
Thank
the
you. Bye
recordings
bye.
to all the sessions via our YouTube channel, which I just dropped the link in the chat, so you can quickly subscribe to the YouTube and check out the recordings for the first session, and we will upload the second session also there for you. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and see you in the next one. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.